This is a collaborative work of the Africa Multiple Cluster of Excellence here at University of Bayreuth, the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa, and the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Dakar in Senegal. And through this seminar series, we invite leading intellectuals and academics to explore the very idea of Africa in general, of Africa in particular, and how it impinges on African studies and this future. Today, we are very delighted to host Professor Finex Ndlovu, who is an Associate Professor of Language and Society at the University of New England in Australia. Professor Ndlovu is a leading scholar in the area of contemporary linguistics and the sociocultural theories of language identity and the diaspora communities. Me and Ndlovu, we don't only share the surnames, we also share common approaches to, as a student of society. We share the decoloniality perspective, we share the epistemologies of the South, as well as the indigenous ways of knowing. And then we've worked together, edited one book, we're editing 2 Routledge handbooks together at the moment. And the Professor Ndlovu is a very prolific scholar who has published extensively in the field, in his field. And I can't read almost everything, but I'll read his key publications. The first one being Language, Vernacular Discourse, and the Nationalism, Uncovering the Myth of Transnational Worlds, which was published in 2018. Then the second one, Hegemony and the Language Policies in Southern Africa, Identity, Integration, and Development. And the third, which was published in 2015. And then the other one, Becoming an African Diaspora in Australia, Language, Culture, and Identity. And then the other one, The Politics of Language and the Nation Building in Zimbabwe. And I'd forgotten that what also brings us together, we come from the same country. Today, he's going to speak to us on the topic African languages and African studies, theories, debates, and the controversies. And I think he is one who is very competent to handle this type of topic. And here at the Africa Multiple Cluster of Excellence, the question of language is very topical to us as part and parcel of the attempt to reconfigure African studies. So that's an important topic for us here. One issue which I must also raise here, I think if I'm not mistaken, it is 2 a.m. in Australia, and the Finex is up because of the commitment to this work. And I must promise, if you make a call, I will also wake up. But we will give you, Prof. Ndlovu, 1 hour to deliver your presentation, and Dr. Bongani Ngulunga will moderate the discussion and also the closing remarks. Thank you so much. Ndlovu, is up to you now.
All right, thank you so much. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Right, excellent, excellent. Okay, so what I would do, maybe I will go straight to share my slides and then say a few things before I get into the points that I prepared to share with you. So I'm going to share my slide now. This one. There. Right, can we see my slides? If you could confirm, please.
Yes, yes.
Excellent, thank you, thank you. Yeah, so first of all, I want to thank everyone that was involved in organizing this event. I can't name everybody by name because I'm not familiar with who did what, but just want to give an umbrella thank you to everyone that was involved in bringing this to fruition. And also, in particular, I want to pay tribute to To Professor Sabelo Ndlovukacheni, to Sabelo, thank you for this very kind and generous welcome to me, and the nice words that you have said about me and my work and my achievements. You rarely tell me that in person, so I'm glad you did that in the public domain. But I must say that Sabelo and I have worked together for a very long time, starting the early 2000s. And one thing I need to highlight is that Sabelo has been my mentor since the early 2000s. We worked together at Midland State University. He was in History and Development Studies, and I was in African Languages Department. One thing about Sabelo is his commitment to the growth of others, which is unimpeachable and beyond reproach to my estimation. So I just want to thank him for that. Very dynamic and versatile colleague who is able to engage with colleagues across different disciplinary divides. And this is why me coming from languages and cultures, him coming from history, development studies, and all those other allied areas, we are able to connect just like that. It's because of Sabelo's ability to connect with people from different disciplinary backgrounds. So I just wanted to highlight that and to thank you for being my mentor and for working with me along the journey of my academic career. So now the next thing I want to say is that here in Australia, we have a tradition of acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands upon which we reside and from which we speak. So I'm located in the Northern Rivers region of the state of New South Wales, 1.5 hours from Brisbane, those of you are familiar with this part of the world, and about 6-7 hours from Sydney. That's where I'm located. And this is the country of the Banjalang indigenous people. So I'm speaking today as a member of staff of the University of New England, and I would like to acknowledge that I'm on the country of the Banjalang Aboriginal people. I pay my respects to the elders of the Banjalang Nation, past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that their cultures, traditions, and worldviews are a vital part of the global knowledge capital. So then after that, I'm moving now to the presentation, to the things that I've prepared to share with you. So what I'm doing here today is to invite you to join me as I walk backwards. I walk backwards into the future. I want you to join me as I walk backwards into the future. That sounds like a strange expression, but precisely that's it. So when you are walking backwards, it doesn't mean you are not moving into the future. You can move into the future through walking backwards, because we don't start from where we are. We've got to go backwards in order to move into the future. So the key point here that I'm trying to put across in this presentation is about the work that has been done by scholars in the area of African languages and African literatures. I will select a few of those because there's lots of such individuals, but I'm selecting just a few to illustrate the points I'm going to be sharing with you. And the other important thing I need to mention here as a preface is that there are lots of things in Africa and about Africa that are not in short supply. Lots of them. And the question of language diversity and the cultures they encode is one of those things that are not in short supply. So if we are trying, it would be remiss, I may put it that way, it would be remiss then if we are entering conversations about the future of African studies or even the current state of African studies and ignore the question of language, that would be remiss, because that is one of the most abundant resources on the African continent. 3,000 plus languages, depending on how you are counting, who is counting, and depending on the language definition tradition that you are using, because some people count dialects as languages, others categorize languages as dialects, and so on and so on. But nevertheless, regardless of who is counting and how they are counting, the fact still remains: language diversity, cultural diversity, and so on are key contours, are key resources that are plenty in Africa. And so to move forward then, to map a future of African studies, we need to center languages. So this is the motivation for me entering into this space and talking specifically to matters about language. So my approach here will be two-pronged. So the goal is, first of all, I will be appraising language and literature scholarship. And then on the other hand, simultaneously, I'm engaging in a praxis or an act of decolonizing. So you will see at the end, when I share with you the list of references, what I mean. I think it will be for you to judge whether I've been successful in the act of not just decolonizing the field I'm talking about, but even engaging in my own decolonization, decolonizing myself, because to decolonize anything, you need to start with self. So I'm trying to decolonize the resources, the references and all, where I tape information from and who I cite and so on. And this has not been a deliberate act on my part. And I was just joking with my daughter after preparing this. And I said, look, I've finished preparing this presentation. And I realized that out of the more than 20 references I have, there is only 2 by non-African scholars. And I thought, I think I've been successful in decolonizing myself, So, so I hope you guys will be able to vindicate me on that and agree with me that indeed you were successful in this endeavor. Okay, so here is the outline of the presentation. So first of all, I will try to look at why languages and literatures matter in African studies. I've touched a little bit on that, but more specifically, I'm going to talk about the foundational issues about language in society, what it is about language in society that we need to look at. And then I will turn the laser light to critical language and literary studies in the context of African studies. And I'll move on to some key thinkers and their contributions in this endeavor. So some of the key thinkers I'm going to be highlighting here, including the work of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Chinua Achebe, Amos Tutola, the work of Jacob Mfangiselo and Shapo, Neville Alexander, and a few others that I will include here. And then I will conclude with a few points, really, just trying to tie everything together, to connect everything together, to show how languages and literatures can help us map a better or alternative future for African studies. So language at large. Now we need to understand that language is the first point of contact in human social interaction. It is through language that we call things into existence. People express their joys, aspirations, and fears and sorrows through language. We inscribe or erase people's identities through language. And language can determine who gets ahead and who is left behind. So it can affect the prospects for ethnic success, for individuals in those ethnic groups, and for groups alike. I mean, matters around politics, economics, communication, development, advocacy, you name it, they are all mediated through language. So whenever there is contact among human beings, for whatever reason or purpose, there is always a language or a set of languages that mediate that particular process or those processes. So eventually, in the end, we find that languages can determine who has access to schools, who has opportunities for economic advancement, who participates in political decisions, who has access to governmental services, who gets treated fairly or unfairly by government agencies. So at the core of this then is the instrument of language policy and planning, because this is something that is done by both experts, academic experts, as well as government agencies at the national level, at international level. So the hierarchization of languages for particular purposes, for particular functions. So all of that is at the center of how languages sit at the heart of what we do as human beings. And this point really relates not just to the field of African studies or even some people who study languages, but it relates to any endeavor, any field of study. You talk of physics, you talk of economics, you talk of biology, whatever it is. There is a language that makes everything that people do in those fields to work. So I thought I might highlight that to start with, so that we can see how language is the anchor of everything we do, really, because it facilitates, or sometimes it can hinder people's participation and so on. Now, so why African scholarship on languages and literatures? Why does it matter in the first instance? So I've got an image here of a book that was published in 1984 by these scholars here, Chinwe Izu and others. It's titled Toward the Decolonization of African Literature. And I'm talking about a book that was published in the early 80s. And the title itself is telling. So these scholars have essentially prefigured what we are doing today. The idea of decolonizing ourselves, decolonizing our fields, decolonizing the work we do. So in the early 80s and even before, scholars in the field of African languages and literatures were already talking decolonizing during that time. So I think this is why I said I'm taking you, walking backwards with you into the future. This is the walking backwards I'm doing here with you. So I want to suggest the following. First of all, I want to suggest that the foundations of the current intellectual discourses in African studies and other fields as well, including the current area we work in on decolonizing and decolonial thought, their foundations can be traced as well to the work that was pioneered by scholars in the area of African languages and literatures. They essentially prefigured what is a novelty today, what is a groundbreaking, what comes across as a groundbreaking and impactful contemporary discourse in our endeavors as academics. Now, I would also want to suggest that the history of serious Africa-centered African studies lies in the area of, can be traced to literatures and African language scholarship. Such work as in the post-colonial, there has been work being done in that area, negritudeism, all of that kind of foundational work, the work of people like Okot Pabitek and others, it was centered on transforming or changing the approach, the idea, the understanding of what it means to be African, to be Black, and so on and so on. So the serious history of Africa-centered African studies can be traced to this kind of scholarship. And I want to suggest that this body of work provides us with a praxis-based approach to doing African studies. So because their theorizations, I would argue, give us ideas that were born out of struggle by Africans, struggles to live, struggles to be recognized as equal human beings. If you look closely at the literature, you will find that it takes us in that direction. And I also want to suggest and argue that when we look at what is called novels, things fall apart, no longer at ease, and so on and so on. Those novels, we generally categorize them as fiction or creative arts. But I want to suggest that these are more authentic accounts of the history of encounters, colonial, religious, cultural, and the responses and resistance to such impositions or encounters, as it were. I will show how in what follows. These are the broad arguments or themes that I'm suggesting here, and I'm going to show how in the next slide why I think this is so. So let's look at, first of all, the work of Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Ngugi wa Thiong'o is a Kenyan, very prolific, and has worked in the space of decolonizing and Africa-centered kind of work for a very, very long time. So he's one example of a scholar that has given us some very important and insightful concepts and theories that inform our thinking today. So I've got an example here of 4 of his works. So this one, Decolonizing the Mind, 1986, was published in 93, sorry, this is 1993. And you have this one, Moving the Center, in the 1980s as well. Writers in Politics, again in the 80s. And then you have this one here, Global Ethics, published in 2012. But he gives us some important concepts. So at least 3 of them are worth highlighting here. The first one is about decolonizing the mind. So way back in the 80s, Ngugi is already talking about decolonizing the mind of the African writer, the mind of the African literary critic, the mind of the African more broadly. And the concept of decolonizing the mind has been picked up and broadened or reiterated in other ways by other scholars, including people like Ndlovu Kacheni and D'Souza Santos, who have written a fair bit on the concept of the cognitive empire. Now, if you look closely, the cognitive empire, it's the empire of the mind. How, even though the empire has gone physically, there is no more empirical occupation of territories and so on, but empire still remains in the minds of the colonized. So Ngugi was already talking about that if we are to make progress, if we are to be successful in pushing back the frontiers of colonization or neo-colonialism, if you like, we need to decolonize the mind first, because that's where everything is resting right now. And he was writing in the 80s. So I would argue that this is a key concept that we learn from someone who is writing as a language and a critical literary scholar. And these are insights that we can learn from. And then there is the other concept, that of linguistic in settlement. I'll explain this one a little later, but let's move on to one of his latest concept, that of poor theory. So he introduces this concept of poor theory in his 2012 book, Global Ethics. I've got a copy with me here, this one, Global Ethics. So now in this book, he talks about, he says poor theory may simply remind us that density of words is not the same thing as complexity of thought, that such density sometimes can obscure clarity of thought. In other words, what he's doing here is that we need to theorize from the margins, and we need to go back to basics, to the foundations, to foundational issues, because when he's talking about poverty or poor theory, he is essentially pointing us towards what you may call a living theory. So theory that is produced out of the quest to resolve problems that you are facing right now. It's not just sitting in the comfort of your office and saying, okay, I've been using these theories that are existing and so on, but what next can I use? He's saying theory that is poor is theory that is produced as a consequence of the desire or the wanting to survive, the wanting to live, to solve your problems. So you can talk of the Black Lives Matters movement, talk of the Roads Must Fall movement, the Fees Must Fall movement in South Africa and elsewhere. Now, they are theories that are produced in those spaces, theories produced in struggle. So when people do that, Ngugi calls it poor theory because it's spontaneous. You are faced with a challenge, you are faced with a problem. So how might I resolve it? You theorize as you go along. So it's theorizing on the go, on the move, in real time to solve problems. And this is what Ngugi says in greater detail. I will reproduce here a big chunk of text because it's important for us to understand what he is saying here. It's a fair bit of a long text, but I think it's important for us to read all of it. So he says that poor means being extremely creative and experimental in order to survive. The homeless try to make a home anywhere, even in places that do not suggest a home. A person without the wherewithal to buy clothes will pick pieces of cloth of whatever color, size, and shape and bring them together. He is clearly not worried about matching colors to please the eyes of an imagined critic at a cocktail party. Necessity drives him to yoke into one, a functional one, the different colors, shapes, and sizes. The poor person's unintentional daring and experimentation comes from necessity, the mother of all inventions. I don't know about you, but you see, for me, this is a very clear and explicit call or for a lesson on how to think otherwise, how to think creatively, without waiting to pick up on the existing tools or arsenal for solving problems, but to think as a consequence of necessity, of the need to solve your immediate pressing challenges. So this is an important concept that we learn from someone who is working in the area of African literatures and languages. Now, let's move to the third one, which I said I'm going to explain a little bit on this concept of linguistic in settlement. Now, I have an image here. Savelo and a few other Africans from real African community, because if you're coming from an African community that doesn't have cattle, I find to connect with that. If I may say just one small passing remark. I've got a colleague of mine here. We work together at the University of New England. He's in the School of Education, and he comes from the eastern part of Zimbabwe, in the area bordering Mozambique, in Chipinge, that area. So we talk and tell him stories about cattle, you know, and all of those things. And he's surprised when I tell him about the types of cattle and what you do in looking after them. And I say, why are you surprised? He say, well, it's because we have never had any cattle. I'm still struggling to process that there is someone who says they come from a village and a community that doesn't have cattle and they've never owned some. And I asked him, so how do you live your life? He says, well, we had some white commercial farmers. That's where we would see cattle, and they would give us pieces of meat. And I said, oh my God, this is horrible. So my father used to say to me, in the Isindebele language, if you grow up to be a man and you don't buy any cow or cattle, you will, in Isindebele, he said, you will die like a dog. because you are not a man. If you do. So now, this is the context. Sabelo can relate to that because, so we grew up herding cows, cattle. And so when you have come back from the pastures with cattle, they get into a kraal, or you call it a cattle pen if you want, a kraal. That's where they sleep, okay? You keep them overnight and open and let them go during the day to herd them. But you see, the point I'm trying to illustrate with this metaphor is that there is one entrance into the cattle kraal. We call it isango. Inkomo zingena ngesango. Now they get through one entrance, and once they have been in there, the head boy or the one who minds them will lock that entrance isango ngemigoqo. So you have the timber that you use to close the thing. They are in there, all right? And they will only come out through the same way they came into. That's the entrance is the exit. They spend the night there. If you choose not to let them out early on, they will be there for a very long time. So they are encircled. They are surrounded. You know, their life is dependent on whoever it is that has locked them in, and when they choose to open the exit so that they can come out. But again, there is this thing. Some of these cattle, some of them, so they jump. Because if you take too long to open for them, some of them can be really wild. They jump and go. They find a way of getting out. But the point I'm trying to illustrate here is that whatever they do, their life, it revolves around whoever is putting them in there. So they don't have urgency. Their fate depends on the person that has encircled them and kept them in this particular kraal or this cattle pen. So I'm using this metaphor to illustrate what Ngugi says about linguistic in-settlement with respect to languages. He says languages that are imposed, or colonial languages. He starts off this with talking about colonial languages in the context of Africa. You can read what he says here, that he says some interesting things, really. My daughter, when she was going through this, she was 14, she picked up an important point where this point about languages being weapons of war. And she says, oh my God, weapons of war. And she jumped and said, yes, that's what language can do. It can be a weapon of war because it encircles you, it contains you, it binds your mind. And so the point here is that, other scholars, including Bernard Cohn and Janina Brut-Rifler and other Africanists, have theorized this, extending Ngugi's idea that colonization and the imposition of colonial languages and also the invention of other language categories was an exercise of command over language in order to produce languages of command. So languages of giving instruction, languages of making sure that you do what the colonizer want you to do. Similar to how cattle are encircled. Whatever they do is dependent on the person who has encircled them. So the encircling affects your praxis. It affects your agency. It affects your thinking. It has an implication on your independence, on your autonomy, on your creativity, and overall on your ontology, on your being, essentially. That's what encircling does. There is no action that you do which is on your own terms, unless, of course, maybe you become disobedient, like that cow, which jumps the wall. That's what you could do, possibly. But essentially, you are locked in there, and your thinking has to be according to the encircling effect of the language that has been imposed. So engaging in academic conversations using a language that encircles. So your thinking is controlled that way. There is some kind of a gatekeeping mechanism of sorts, but some people can exercise agency through subversion and so on. Now, let's look at the metaphor of encirclement in African studies. So I'm taking it from a cow to language to African studies, if you want to put it that way, from a cow to language to African studies. How do these things map together? So I put together this. So linguistic in settlement is at the center there. And in Africa, we have different types of languages that were produced through processes of language policy and planning and so on. So you have what are called colonial languages. So you talk of Africa, divided into regions named after colonial languages. So the bulk of West Africa is called Francophone Africa, and some pockets of Anglophone like Nigeria and a few other countries, Ghana. But the majority of West African countries, they are called Francophone Africa, taken after French, all right? And then the majority of the Southern Africa and parts of East Africa, you are called Anglophone Africa, all right? Taken after the colonial language of the Anglo people, the English, as it were. And then you have Lusophone Africa, and so on and so on, those kinds of things, all right? So that is the kind of encircling. So the division according to former colonial languages of before. And then you have, of course, languages that were invented as part and parcel of constructing the colonial state. So the languages of the state. So you have what are called national languages in different countries. And those national languages are standardized or are standard languages. So they were created specifically for the purposes of sustaining the catechism of one nation, one language, one people. So that kind of so you have national languages that were invented for specifically for those purposes. They have an encircling effect. And then it translates to also colonial language education policies. Those of you from South Africa will be familiar with the Bantu education system that was imposed under apartheid in the 1950s, but it's more specifically, I think 1954. That's when the Bantu education policy was imposed. So you are enclosed, as it were, all right? Zululand, this is your language in Zulu. That's what it is. There's no going out. And so on other regions, the same kind of a thing. Boputo Tswana, this is your language included in there. You are encircled and so on and so on. So these kinds of language education policies have an encircling effect. You can say the same thing as well. Lingua francas, or what are called vehicular cross-border languages. We'll talk more about these when we get to the next few slides. But then how does this map onto African studies? So this is what I'm trying to do here. Here is the map of Africa with the regions that have all these divisions I'm talking about, the categorization. So this kind of linguistic in settlement, theorized by Ngugi, maps onto how Africa is divided according to former colonial languages, but also according to, as I said, local national official languages for different nation states. But these nation states that we have today, they are a legacy or a vestige of the colonial state. So it's the same thing, as it were. But at the same time, you see, what is happening in terms of the division of Africa into this region also maps back onto languages as well. So it's kind of a dialectical relationship that exists. So when we do African studies, then you have people that know virtually nothing about Southern Africa because their specialty is West Africa, all right? People that don't know much about East Africa because their specialty is, North Africa, that kind of a thing. So it's a balkanized approach to African studies. And this is where Nguki's concept of linguistic in settlement comes in. All right. So so far so good with Nguki. Let's move to another African literary critic and language scholar, and this is Chinua Achebe. So you know Chinua Achebe is among the most prolific writers on the African writers. He comes from Nigeria. So he wrote lots and lots of books, critical novels. But he gives us numerous concepts in some of these works that I'm illustrating with here, like Things Fall Apart, Arrow of God, No Longer at Ease, Mourning Yet on Creation Day, and so on and so on, A Man of the People. Now, he highlights in all of these works the pitfalls of false consciousness, particularly at the point of colonial encounters. He highlights the responses and resistance to colonialism. You know, the story of Okonkwo in Things Fall Apart, and how the missionaries that are coming into the community and trying to build a church and all of those, the struggles that are, the tensions that take place. He highlights all of those things, and it's not a work of fiction or creative art. It's a historical account of encounters. You know, he provides a critique of the betrayal of the masses by post-colonial elites, corruption, neo-colonialism, and so on. And also the conundrums of the dual heritage for the African, you know, Christianity versus African tradition, what to choose, you know, Okonkwo almost disowning his son because he has decided to go and live with the missionaries. He has accepted the Christian faith. All of those kinds of things, they are highlighted here. But essentially, this is also a pushback against European assumptions of universality in scholarship. He does that in all of these his works. And another thing that Achebe does is insisting on interconnections of art and life, which to me points us towards a more realistic African studies enterprise, one that embeds or integrates biographical accounts of both the scholars and the people, the community. So it talks about biographies, you know, the stories of people embedded in the narrative of what it means to be African and what Africa is. He advocates for a scholarship that resonates with the lived experiences of our communities. All right. So the need to understand, he says in his No Longer at Ease, he says we need to understand where the rain began to beat us and how to build a steadier and roomier shelter. Isn't this a beautiful expression? You know, there is an abundance use of African proverbs, folklore, wisdoms, and so on and so on, just to put across a subtle and salient point. So where the rain began to beat us and how to build a roomier shelter. So when we get into African studies, we must ponder upon this point. Where did things start getting wrong in our understanding of African studies and in the way we engage in African studies, which calls for us to say, what is the future of African studies? How might we map African studies in a better way? And again, I will reiterate my earlier point. It's about walking backwards into the future, because you are trying to find where things started going wrong and then move forward. That's what Things Fall Apart is about, essentially. It's precisely about that. So this is a call for me, I think, to decolonize ourselves and to decolonize our practice as a way of trying to carve a better future for an African studies that approximates what Africa is and who Africans are and how they live their lives. All right. So far, so good about Achebe. We'll leave him there. There's lots of things we can say about the work of Chinua Achebe, lots of things around language, you know, what he says about using English for communicating his ideas and so on, that he says, he argues that, well, I will use English to write. because it's a tool that I have at my disposal. And what I want is to communicate what I'm communicating to the audience, to the wider community, and so on. So now let's move to another prolific scholar, literary critic, coming again from West Africa, from Nigeria, and this is Amos Tutola. Amos Tutola was a prolific writer who wrote short stories. You call them stories, but really they were not stories. They are accounts of historical colonial encounters. So let's start with this one, the palm wine drunkard. Now, when the title itself, the palm wine drunkard. So it's a drunk. This is a drunkard. It's essentially a drunkard, but he chose to title it the palm wine drunkard and not drunk or drunk person, the drunkard. And this is a deliberate act of epistemic disobedience, breaking the rules of the master's language as a way of writing back to empire. He chooses to bring together bits and pieces of words and expressions from English, from the local languages, from Igbo, and so on, and bring them together to communicate. And he writes as he likes. He writes as he pleases. He is undisciplined, if I may put it that way, because we academics are trained to be disciplined. That's why we belong to disciplines, right? It's disciplining you to do things in a particular conventional way. But Amos Tutola just broke the boundaries, or broke all those rules, the rules of the English language, packaged things together. And, he was able to communicate his ideas nevertheless. So now, a key concept that he brings up in his work is that of ontologies of incompleteness. Essentially meaning that there is nothing and there is no one and there is no tradition of knowing that is complete on its own without others. So everything on its own is partial, is incomplete. It needs others to complete it. Essentially, that's why he brings bits and pieces of words from different languages, put them together, they complete one another. And there's a story here of the skull, which doesn't have all other limbs. But the skull wants to quote a beautiful girl, a beautiful lady, but doesn't have limbs. So how do I do it? Borrows bits and pieces of limbs from others. Borrows a hand from someone, borrows a leg, borrows, ears, borrows, toes, borrows this to have a complete body. And then the girl falls for the skull. And, but then because these are borrowed robes, these are borrowed things, you've got to give them back. And they are together now. The owners of these other body parts, they need them back. So the skull, one by one, falls apart, all those things go, all those things go, all those things go. And the girl realizes, well, it's just a skull. So essentially, the point is we are complete because of others. Without others, we are a skull. Others beautify them. Others beautify us. They complete us. They make us to be who we are. And this is what the idea of interconnections and ontologies of incompleteness is about. So essentially, what Amos Tutola does here is to challenge the dichotomies of knowledges, cultures, universes, and cosmologies, looking at things in duality to say this versus that. Everything is connected. And he points us towards the idea of infinite possibilities that are beyond the colonial epistemologies in which nearly all of us here were trained in. We are trained in those epistemologies, but there are infinite possibilities out there of other ways and traditions of knowing. He points us also towards unshackling from an uncritical embrace of Eurocentric modernity as the only solution or as the only way of knowing. There are multiple diverse traditions of knowing. So the image of the skull now, so you see, the skull on its own without other body parts is hollow. And this is a mockery of the hollowness of a Western modernity and its pretensions of completeness. Its Western modernity is not complete on its own. It is completed by other modernities, other traditions of knowing from elsewhere that make it complete. So as you can see, this is a weighing into our thinking about African studies. Francis Nyam Joe, an anthropologist from the Cameroon grasslands, but works at the University of Cape Town and has been for a very long time. He wrote this book in 2017, dedicated an entire book, 310-page book on Amos Tutola, and it's titled Drinking from the Cosmic God, How Amos Tutola Can Change Our Minds. You know, he emphasizes the key points really that we learn from the work of Amos Tutola, who writes what you traditionally consider to be a novel. But he points us towards the benefits of that work to us as Africanists or African studies scholars. So the points around incompleteness, interconnectedness, interdependency, temporality, and convivial scholarship, where we connect with other people in order to complete ourselves. All right, now, so I've taken you from the East, where the sun rises. So East Africa, we spoke about Ngugi and so on and so on, and took you to the West, where the sun sets, all right? West Africa and Africa. Now I'm taking you to down south, to the south. I would call it the fount of wisdom, because I'm from Southern Africa, but there's wisdom everywhere anyway. All right, so now I'm taking you to the south. Let's move to the south. I know, don't ask me about why are you not talking about north. Well, this is a seminar that is only 1 hour long, so I have space for the north, but it will take another seminar to talk about North Africa as well, you know, the work that comes from there, because there is lots of it that is relevant, but I will just limit myself to the east, west, and south. So now, let's look at the work of Jacob Mfaniselwa Nhlapo. Now, Jacob Nhlapo had a diverse background. He was a scholar, a lawyer from South Africa, a lawyer, a journalist, and a political activist under the banner of the New African Movement and the African National Congress. He was not a linguist by training, but was well ahead of his time on matters around language. He prefigured the current and quite contemporary theory of translanguaging. I don't know if there are people in this room or on Zoom or in the audience that are familiar with this new current contemporary theory around translanguaging. In the 1940s, 1944, 1945, Jacob Nhlapo was already talking about points that speak to what we see as a novelty today, the idea of translanguaging. Here is what he said way back in 1944. He says, joining languages together is a good thing. It is really happening, and it will go on happening wherever two or more languages are spoken in the same place. All we need to do is to help with the mixing of the languages and try to show that mixing up the languages is nothing to be ashamed of. All right? So he's already speaking on that, a pushback on linguistic purism. So this touches on, highlights the point around orthographic harmonization, or the harmonization of writing systems. So harmonization is about converging on writing systems. I will explain a little bit more about what Jacob Nhlapo meant by that. So, but the idea of harmonization, to say he was focusing specifically on Nguni and Sotho languages in Southern Africa. And he was saying, well, it is possible that you can teach students who are from predominantly an isiZulu background, isiXhosa, isiSwati background. You can teach them in the same class, and they can interact with one another in their respective languages, only to converge in the written text, which must be written in an orthography common to all. This is what harmonization is about, to say we will have a shared writing system, but you can continue, because these varieties are mutually intelligible. So the concept mutually intelligible, meaning that you speak your variety, I speak mine, we can understand one another. this is the thing that happens across different language groups. I don't know very much about European languages, but I would imagine someone speaking French or maybe Portuguese and Spanish, that kind of a thing, understanding one another. That's what mutual intelligibility is all about. So you can continue speaking in your variety, I speak in mine, and we understand. We see this in many African communities. Someone speaking in isiZulu and someone speaking in Sesotho, or someone speaking in Setswana, and someone speaking in Xhosa, they understand one another. You don't have to switch to the other variety. So that's what mutual intelligibility does. So Jacob Mhlapho then, based on that, he tries to unsettle colonially imposed, balkanized Africa, forging African unity through a language-based idea of Africa. Harmonization as opposed to standardization. I will talk about that in a moment. So the other point is about how to produce Pan-African identities, Pan-African literacies to enhance educational and intercultural understanding. Here is another, so Jacob Mhlapho pioneered that. And then in the 1980s, Neville Alexander, also he was at the University of Cape Town. And he picked up Jacob Mhlapho's ideas on harmonization and pushed them forward. And his argument really was essentially similar to what Jacob Mhlapho said, but Neville Alexander was also an anti-apartheid political activist coming from a language background. He was instrumental in bringing language into the agenda of the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. So today we say South Africa has a multilingual policy that has 12 official languages, including 9 African languages, Afrikaans, English, and sign language, and so on. Neville Alexander was instrumental in that, in the work. So he brought that to the center of the struggle of the anti-apartheid in South Africa. So this tiny book, I've got a copy with me here. This little book, you can read it in like less than an hour. This little book that he published, I hope you can see it, in 1989, titled Language Policy and National Unity in South Africa or Tanzania. So he was looking precisely at that, how you can leverage the languages of South Africa and use them for purposes of building a better, South Africa more with cross-cultural understanding and so on and so on. So his argument really was that South Africa's language policies have historically been linked to racial inequality from 1652. So language, therefore, is central in promoting, in a post-racial, post-apartheid South Africa, is essential for promoting non-racialism, anti-racism, and anti-ethnicism. It remains to see whether these ideas were successful. Now we are 3 decades or so in post-apartheid South Africa. I think it's time to re-evaluate and see whether these ideas did work or are working, or whatever it is that is occurring at the moment. So we might want to re-evaluate that. But you see, in suggesting then the convergence on a common writing system, this was not a way of trying to supplant the numerous African languages into some homogeneous standard form, but it's an additive measure to say you can work within your own variety, your own language, but we converge in writing. We are not wanting to erase the diversity of languages. It remains, but for purposes of facilitating, literacy acquisition, education, and so on, to maximize economies of scale in producing books and so on, why not converge in a common writing system? And then we can continue in other ways to use our languages. But you see, even in those early days, harmonization was criticized. There were critics, people who were skeptical of harmonization. And in 1953, during the time of Jacob Mhlapho, Peter N. Raboroko wrote this paper, this article titled The Linguistic Revolution. And it was a critique of harmonization. So harmonization was not well received. these early critics are, for example, in 1992, Professor Sizwe Sacho, he was around. I understand he passed on in 2021. He was a professor at the University of Cape Town. This is what he said. Now, he was one of the critics, and he wrote about what he called the Neville Alexander option versus his own, what he called the tongues option or the pragmatic principle. And this is what he says here, that in criticizing harmonizing, he says, what about a more and no less principle when it comes to the existing languages of South Africa? In other words, wouldn't it be expedient to try to accommodate the existing languages of South Africa, including English and Afrikaans, as they are? Shouldn't we refrain from tampering with them in any artificial way? So, because harmonization is seen as like it's a tampering with languages. So effectively, he was saying we need to maintain the status quo. But I would argue that if agents of colonial imperialism and the architecture of apartheid sociolinguistic engineering could tamper with languages for all the bad reasons, like of containment, why can't we do the same for good cause, which is to facilitate literacy acquisition across the different African communities? So it's something that I think harmonization, although it remains contentious even to the present day, it has a promise if properly operationalized. So last year, I published this article in the South African Journal of African Languages, where I try to revisit and re-evaluate harmonization as a tool for building Pan-African identities more viable and sustained. So I compare the two things here. There is the concept of standardization, which was spearheaded by colonialists, to standardize languages, to say they have to be uniform. The way you speak must closely approximate the writing system of a language, and so on and so on. So standardization. So I put these two things side by side. This is a direct extract from the article I published last year. So you can see the comparison here, that standardization on the one hand is about uniform and inflexible writing systems, while harmonization is about flexible writing systems that accommodate the fact that you can continue to use your own variety the way you like, as it were. So written form is deemed to be the measure of correct use under standardization. Speakers retain their own varieties and converge in reading and writing. These are some of the points I throw in there in terms of comparing the two things. So my preference is for harmonization, because standardization tends to erase the diversity that should or must exist. And I give examples here of words coming from 4 Nguni languages: isiNdebele, isiSwati, isiZulu, and isiXhosa. These words are literally the same. All right, they are essentially the same, but they are written and spelled differently across these varieties. What is the point? So essentially, which means if you are producing a text or a textbook, you've got to produce 4 textbooks. One is isiNdebele, one is Swati, one is isiZulu, one is isiXhosa. But if you look closely at these words, the variation, the difference is very, very minute. And I published this as it is. I sent it, the editors said to me, can you please put some English glosses or translations for these words? I refused. I said, well, if you want me to put the English glosses to this, because I was engaging in an act of decolonizing, I said, I'm not going to put anyone who is interested, who wants to learn, is going to look up these words and find the translation in English, because this is what people who have English as a second or additional language do all the time. When they are English words that are difficult, that you're not familiar with, you've got to look them up and find what they mean. So to those of you that don't speak these languages, here is an exercise for you. Here's an assignment for you. Can you go find what the meanings of these are in English? It's something that some of us do all the time. So I presented them as they are. Fortunately, the editors of the journal understood my argument, because I was going to pull out the paper if they were going to insist that I need to put translations. I was very forthright with them and say, well, if you want me to put translations, I will withdraw my paper. But they understood where I was coming from, and it was published as it is. So this is an act of decolonizing that I'm engaging in here in everything I do. So now, later generations then, in terms of the harmonization project, we have people like Kwesi Pra, under the Center for Advanced Study of African Society, that was originally based at the University of Cape Town and moved to University of Western Cape. They have continued this idea of harmonization and pushed it forward, but a more ambitious approach, because the work of Jacob Mhlapo and Neville Alexander was specifically focusing on the South African or Southern African context. But Kwesi Pra and others have pushed it continent-wide to say, how can we build African cultural literacy through the process of harmonization? So language as the root for African unity. And this has led to what are called vehicular cross-border languages by the African Academy of Languages. So the premise here is that what Pra says and others is that 80 to 85% of Africans speak 15 to 17 core languages, what he calls core languages. So harmonization will get us to that, to say these languages, varieties, they are related, they can converge in terms of, writing and so on and so on. So it's about decolonizing African language and literacy education. Here is Professor Pra here, and he also talks about African languages and African development, how languages are at the center of development. 2 points he mentions. The first one being that development is first and foremost cultural and then economic. And then he goes on to say that wherever there is development, it must be visible in the everyday lives of the ordinary people. And this is where language comes in, because when it's happening at the local level, it's mediated by particular language types, and we need to see those languages being used. So this kind of work has had an impact and influence at the level of the African Union. So the African Academy of Languages developed these, what they call vehicular cross-border languages. So languages that are used across regions, as it were, across different communities. So I have a list of them here that provided, and this year was there was the African Languages Week that was celebrated by the African Academy of Languages. So African languages, the theme was African languages for sustainable food security, cultural and socio-economic development for the Africa we want. So you see that this work is transcending or cutting across into other areas that are at the center of African studies. So your concept of development, food security, and so on and so on and so on. Now, it will be remiss for me to finish this talk without touching on the work of Sinfri Makoni, because he is a disruptor. He is good at disrupting and unsettling things as a way of getting us to think afresh. So Sinfri Makoni in 2003 and then later 2007, working together with Alistair Penny-Cook, introduced the idea of disinventing and reconstituting languages. In other words, the premise is that languages as we know them as countable things or objects were a product of invention. So, and they need to be disinvented and then reconstituted. This has a strong implication on African studies. We know African studies most of the time is looked at in terms of area studies, no specialization. So African studies, which area of African studies? And then you pick a pocket and say, oh, West Africa, or even just a country, or even a community. There are historians, I know of historians that focus on a small community. They built their entire career I can see Samuel is laughing there. He knows who I'm talking about. Their entire career on studying one community, and then they say, I am an African studies specialist. There's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with the micro, but you also need to connect with the bigger picture to build a complete picture. What are the connections? What are the divergences and convergences? And if you don't know about the other areas, how then do you claim that to be African studies? All right. So he's talking, Sinfil Makoni is pointing us in that direction, then to disinvent things and reconstitute. So the critique of language is a self-contained, countable objects or things. He goes on to tell us about how languages are, particularly in the African context and other former colonized part of the world, they are semiotic artifacts of global coloniality, which were co-invented with the modern or colonial nation state. You remember he pointed out earlier that the catechism of one nation, one language, one people. So when the colonial nation states were being invented, there was need to invent a language for the nation state that will bind people together, you know. So just like national flags, national anthems, so national languages are like that. They are semiotic artifacts of global coloniality, you know. But yet he proposes an alternative, that we must look at African languages as multi-layered, interconnected chains. So they are interconnections, and this connects with the idea of harmonization we've talked about, you know, that these are connected, they are mutually intelligible. So multi-layered, interconnected chains. So languages reimagined through the prism or metaphor of frontiers to reflect the real repertoires of real people in their real everyday lives. I don't know of people, real human beings, who speak in a standard language every day. I've never seen one, except in forums, probably, but even here, you find that I've been throwing in some expressions from isiNdebele, from isiZulu, from isiXhosa, and so on and so on. That's how real human beings speak. I'm not just sticking to English, you know? So that's precisely the point. So real people in their real everyday lives, they use repertoires and not languages, because languages are named things out there. So repertoires are about people. So in trying to understand then how language operates in society, we must focus on human beings and not languages. Often we tend to say, well, languages, English has done this, Afrikaans has done this, French has done. It's not French that has done that. It's human beings who are doing things with languages. So now our challenge as African studies scholars is, what must we do with African languages to better improve the enterprise of African studies? And I think the scholars that I have highlighted here, they are giving us a pathway for doing that. So this maps then onto how we might think about African identities, African studies anew. I'm getting to a close. I have 2 slides to wind this up. I know you are tired of listening to me. This African, he never stops. He keeps on talking. Why can't he stop? Anyway, I'm about to finish, all right? All right, so now, I like using metaphors because I grew up in a place where people use the circumlocution to communicate a point, all right? And I grew up in a village with grandmothers and telling us stories, you know, moral stories, stories about things, and then use that story to communicate a point. So I'm getting to another metaphor here. It might be a familiar metaphor to some of you, but it's a useful one. The African studies elephant metaphor. I like the elephant metaphor, not because it's my surname, but because it illustrates an important point. So the story is told of 6 men here who were blind men, and they touch an elephant, different parts of an elephant. So someone touches the tail of an elephant and then says, well, an elephant, I think it's like a rope, because they touched the tail. And another one touches the leg of an elephant. No, but an elephant, I think it's like a tree. It's a trunk of a tree. It's a tree trunk because they felt the massive leg of an elephant. And the other one touches, the horn of an elephant or whatever you call the ivory or something. And well, it's like a spear. So each one of them describes, someone touches the ear, the massive ear of an elephant. No, I think an elephant is like a blanket. That's what it's like, right? So they describe the elephant according to their experience, their partial experience. And I would argue that none of these 6 men is necessarily wrong. Yet none of them gives us a complete picture either. Each account is a partial description of an elephant, and it only describes that part which the person touched. Only in their totality do they tell us what an elephant looks like. So what it tells us here is that the field of African studies is a product of a collaborative enterprise, bringing together the diverse disciplinary perspectives we can bring, and together working together across disciplines and across fields of expertise, we can build a better and a complete picture of what the future of African studies might look like. All right, so conclusion. What are the implications of all I have said, all the things I've said for the future of African studies? I think one of the key implications is that about pushing back what I have called with my colleague from St. Andrews, Thomas Kamsela, we have called it methodological tribalism in the study of Africa, whereby we are wedded to a particular region or a particular small pocket and focus just on that. We call that methodological tribalism. Some of the things I've said here, they point us towards challenging colonial legacies of area studies and making it broader, understanding that Africa is an interconnected whole. It's not just about the different pockets, different areas, different regions, centering ontologies of incompleteness, that nothing is complete on its own without others. You think about knowledge traditions, you think about approaches, you think about disciplines, and so on and so on. Nothing, cultures, and so on. Everything is completed by others. So promoting convivial scholarship, that is collaboration, not competition, co-creation and co-production. And most importantly, learning together with our social communities as equal partners in the spirit of mutual respect. So what we aim at, overall, what I'm trying to communicate here is that we are aiming at frontier African studies, which is a product of talking about frontier Africa, frontier African languages, and frontier African identities, so which are interconnections. That's what we are aiming at. So the future of African studies, I would submit, is one that is built around a frontier approach to learning about Africa, to reimagining Africa from a frontier perspective. This is my conclusion, a summary of everything I have said. So now I'll take you back to my preliminary point about the two-pronged goal of this presentation. The first one was to give you a run-through of some of the ideas that were pioneered by scholars in language and literatures. And I think I've tried to do that by giving examples of people that have written and gave us concepts. Ngugi, Achebe, Amos Tutola, Jacob Mhlapo and others have tried to do that. But the second task was that of decolonizing myself and decolonizing my practice through challenging citation politics. So these are the resources that I have consulted. And I can tell you that I can count here Brut Griffler, Janina Brut Griffler, not African, right? Not really. And look at the rest. Bernard Cohn, is not, you may not, but everybody else is African or has some connection of African, Africa of sorts. And this is an important thing, I think, for all of us to do, to ask ourselves, who informs our thinking? Who do we cite? and why. So I've tried to bring together here a body of work that is rarely cited, and yet it is impactful. It has contributed some groundbreaking ideas that we can utilize and build a better future for African studies. I will leave it here. I have spoken for a very long time, and yes, thank you so much for listening, and thank you everyone for attending and joining. There are a few faces here that I'm familiar with. I think Oironke Oyumi is there. I have met her before. She's in online. I met her when I was at UNISA a few years back. And there is my PhD student there. I don't know if he's still around. His name is Chris Odiambo. He started a few months back with me here, and he's there. And a few other people, but I'm not familiar with most of you. So this is me, okay? So, and Sabelo knows more about me, all right? And he told you. Okay, so I'll leave it here. Thanks again for your attention. And I don't take for granted people. Because you suspend other things to come and listen to me speak. So it's a special thing for me to have people stop doing other important things they want to do and come to listen to me. So I don't take people's time for granted. I try to, and I hope I have not wasted your time. If I have, just drop me an email, and maybe in the future I'll try to do things differently. Okay, all right, thanks so much. I might leave it here and hand over to the moderators.
Bongani, that's your turn.
Can you hear me? Because I'm not sure anymore whether you can hear me. Yes. Well, thank you very much. It was insightful. And if you have comments, please go ahead. That's a wonderful presentation. So you can just raise your hand or just speak. Try to make it as conversational as possible.
Can
you hear me? Sorry.
Can you see their hands?
Michelle is raising her hand.
Yes, can I speak?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, I wanted to thank you very much for this fantastic and engaged talk. It's rare to listen such a warm talk in the university sphere. I just wanted to tell you that I'm writing on similar topics, and that in my case, it's more the idea of creolization, for example, brought about by Edouard Glissant, and in the Antillean and Caribbean sphere, and joined all this together with the philosophy of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, for example. I just wanted to mention that. But thank you very much. I will read a lot of the books mentioned by you. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Michaela. Maybe let's get in touch offline and exchange ideas.
Okay.
Maybe, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tamode.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. I was really engaged all through. I'm a lawyer, I'm a legal scholar, doing my PhD in law at the University of Ottawa in Canada. And
can you speak up a bit, Tamode, so that we can hear you?
Hello?
Yes, can you speak up a bit so
Okay.
that we can hear you? Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Okay.
Okay, good. So it was a wonderful presentation. And I just want to say that, as you mentioned in your last statement, that diverse disciplinary perspectives need to be pulled together for African studies, and especially African languages, to move forward. And I'm looking into copyright law and how the translation rights in copyright law muffled diverse African creativity or African linguistic plurality. Have you come across copyright-related restrictions in your work, or in how they muffle African creativity, especially leveraging on Africa's linguistic diversity for more inclusive literary programs. Thank you.
Yes, thanks so much. Thanks so much, Damola. I haven't come across like the copyright side of things, and I think it's something very important which we must explore further to see how copyright is a part of all of this, because sometimes some works, that we might be wanting to access may be subject to copyright restrictions, and we are limited, and we miss out on that, because I mean it takes us to the politics of publishing, I think, the publishing industry and all. It's a whole subject on its own, I think, that needs to be looked at with the idea or the goal of decolonizing that part, really. Yeah, so thanks for that point. I haven't gone deeper into that really to look closely at what's happening in that space. Yeah. Thank you.
So that's what my ongoing PhD research is all about. And if you don't mind, I'm going to send you an email after this section, and if we can take the conversation further.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof.
We have someone here in the room.
Thank you very much for this very interesting lecture. It is very informative for me. I was saying in the chat that your action of not translating those quotes from African language as an act also of epistemic disobedience.
Yes, yes, I saw that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have some remarks regarding what you call decolonizing citation politics. Can you hear me?
Yes. I'm listening.
Okay. Yeah. So I was wondering if really we can make it better, like to include also women writers. Yeah, because I only see male on the on the list.
You got me there. You really.
Yeah.
Yes.
And also maybe to include all the. It is really noisy. I don't know where is it. Okay. Yeah, I was wondering also if you can include critical African studies from other part of the world, maybe from Latin America, but even here in Europe, I think because the geographical location doesn't necessarily reflect the epistemological stand, I think. Yeah, those are the remarks I wanted to make.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much again. I'm not in the study in the literature, but I have really enjoyed the talk. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Yes, thanks. I think I've got Ama Ata Aidu from Ghana. She speaks to these things. She is late. She passed on a few weeks ago, I think, or months ago. She speaks to these things, and it's one woman that I think should have been in the mix. And so thanks so much for pointing me in the gender direction. I'm imagining Oeronke or Ewumi is wanting to weigh into that as well.
Exactly.
I knew, because I know you very well.
Hamisu preempted me, and I'm happy he did, because I didn't want to be encircled by your lecture. So I'm glad he went over the fence, and I will,
right.
Because my pondering, I don't know if we can answer that question. Since mothers' own languages, we talk about mother tongue, How can such an erudite lecture not incorporate the mothers? I'm wondering. But that's not my question.
Yes. Right. Yes. Thank you. I think that is at the heart of the politics of citation, which I was trying to bypass, but I think I failed the mark on that one, I must admit. Yes. So the gender dimension, I think it's a significant one. And I take your point. I really take your observation. It's something that needs to be taken into account moving forward to get the balance right. There is a lot of good work done by African women in language, in literary critics, and so on and so on. There's plenty of that. So point taken. Thanks so much, Oeronke, and it's nice to see you here. We were together at UNISA a few years back, and I enjoyed interactions with you.
Under our boss, Sabelo.
Yes.
Anyway, I have two comments and then a real question. Okay. My comment is this. I appreciate the fact that you started your lecture with the fact that languages are abundant in Africa. And I like the way you put it when you said one thing that is abundant in Africa is language. I like that because when people think of Africa, they always think of it as a place of lack. I think we should always start with abundance. If we're not starting with abundance, it's not because there's no abundance on the continent. It's because we can't see it. So we need to see abundance. And then the question is how to find it, how to recreate it, what to make of it. But I like that idea of abundance. Then the second thing I also liked about the way you started, especially if there are young scholars here or graduate students. I remembered when I got into graduate school, a very smart African-American woman taught me from the very first year when I was at UC Berkeley, that when you want to choose a course that you are going to take in a place where you have choices, get the professor's syllabus and see how many Africans or other people he cites before you can decide on it. I think it's a very important lesson. You can't do it on everything or in all places, but it's a good indication. So I'll leave that alone. My question is this. Your lecture was on the question of language in African studies. But I also want to direct us to the question of language in Africa itself, not beyond the studies, in society, on the ground. And I think that beyond African studies, of course, what we want to see, even with harmonization, is what we can do with language in society and bring people together and all that. And if you can recall, in fact, the book just came out this week, my edited book on naming. You had helped in editing one chapter of the book years ago. Yeah, you read the chapter for me. The book just came out this week. So the title of the book is Naming Africans on the Epistemic Value of African Names. When I started the book, I was totally focused on names, but as the book progressed, it finally dawned on me in ways that it hadn't before, that the whole question of naming and Africans bearing their own name is an extension of the question of language in Africa. And the more I think about that, it seems to me that whether people bear African languages, African named languages, is a test of how we a little noisy. It's a test of how receptive we are to these languages that we're promoting. You meet Africans today, they are decolonizing, but they're still Peter, Paul, and Mary. We're decolonizing. And I don't think this insistence on my part that Africans should look at names, I don't think it's a frivolous question. But the way I imagine it, and probably the way it happens, is that when Africans, real Africans, actually have a choice to choose between something African, like an African name, in the 21st century, they reject it and still give their children Peter, Paul, and Mary, and Joseph, and what have you. I wonder, as a linguist, what you have to say to that. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Thanks so much for that, Oironke. I mean, that was most largely a comment, and of course the question at the end. I totally agree and share your insights on the language in Africa and not in Africa, just in African studies. So I would add and say that I think partly to the response to your question is that language in Africa must be seen, or even language anywhere actually, must be seen or understood as a process and as part of being, as part of who people are, and not as an institution, because currently languages are seen as an institution, and many linguists they have written quite a fair bit on this, critiquing, really putting side by side the two opposing views of language as an institution and language as process, and language as part of living your life, you know, as human beings. So I think I agree with what you are saying there, and maybe we can engage further on this. There seems to be some background noise somewhere. I don't know where it's coming from.
Okay, thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Pascal?
He seemed not to see.
He seems not to see.
All right.
The question to the.
Sorry. Hello. It's quiet.
Go ahead, Pascal.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Ndlovu, for this fantastic, insightful, and informative, as well as down the memory lane presentation. And I said down the memory lane because of some of the authors you've mentioned, like Thiogo, Chinua Achebe, and thankfully mentioned my brother Kot Pibitek, which reminded me of where Palawino. And also a little bit of decolonizing your citation. It is, or trying to, it is always my unending mantra, especially regarding the politics of citation, that when I'm working with the students, something that I always point out a lot, and especially looking at African women, Black women, or Black authors. Anyhow, my question is, you referred to Ngugi's poor theory, where they suggest that we should think otherwise, in situ, to develop theories rather than relying on employing the already existing ones. For instance, you've just mentioned methodological tribalism, which is quite interesting. I don't know how much it is being looked at on the African continent, and how much is being applied or employed in different studies or explanations. How is the use of poor theory possible in Africa, where most countries, as stand to be corrected, are still stuck with theorizing and or conceptualizing, drawing on mostly theories from the West, and that is drummed into our minds, especially if you've had education in the Global South. I mean, I'll talk about Africa in the undergrad classes. If you try to write otherwise, like, you are not writing as the way you're supposed to be writing, unless you want to fail and have loads of retakes, and which means you're not going to complete your undergrad studies. So you have to write the way you are told, and the way we are told is to write from the Western perspectives. And also the other issue is, if we try to think otherwise, which platforms are there to promote this otherwise thinking? And which platforms are there? And when we talk about high impact journals, you know where they're based mostly. Surprisingly, last week, talking about the journals, I went through a number of journals looking at the composition of their editors.
Can you move a bit, Pascal? We cannot hear you well.
Boards. Not even 5 people from Africa, from, I think I looked at 6 journals, different journals within
Pascal,
the
we cannot hear you well. Can you move on?
Studies and others. I saw, can you hear? Probably I'll leave.
Yeah, I think you have said quite a fair bit. Like, from what was audible as you were speaking, there are a few things I think that I can respond to. Unfortunately, part of what you said wasn't clear, but there are a few things that are really important questions you raise about how poor theory can be used in Africa. You know, you are complaining about why the fact that we're relying on external theories that come. This is precisely the point that is addressed by Ngugi's other concept that I try to use with a metaphor, that of encirclement. We are encircled in terms of a methodology, in terms of theories. And one way of breaking out of encirclement is that of exercising epistemic disobedience. And I have chosen deliberately, personally, I've chosen to defy some of the conventions, even in terms of the style of writing an essay or a journal article. I have moved away from following the conventions. I just write. So the thing is exercising epistemic disobedience. So now, you see, poor theory is not something that is already existing. It's something that is produced as you go, because, like, for example, you are saying, we are faced with this problem of saying we have to use methods and tools that are imposed from outside, and that is a problem you are facing. And so it's an opportunity then for engaging in the praxis of saying, okay, how might I produce an alternative theory considering the conundrum I'm faced with, that of having any position from outside? So think otherwise. What might I do? But you raise another important point that I want to comment as well, which is always raised more often than not, that of the absence of platforms for thinking otherwise, because you talk about, well, we are required to publish in high impact journals. Again, that needs to be questioned and critiqued, because high impact by whose standards? So you are encircled again. So your profundity or your ability to be productive as a scholar is encircled. You can't be as productive because you are required to publish in these the standards of how these journals are said to be high impact. You are not part of, you didn't participate in the decision of ranking these journals, and you are following through. So this is where epistemic disobedience takes place, because you are encircled. The concept of encirclement is very important. Remember how I explained it, to say, when you are encircled, you have no agency. You don't think according to your own terms. You think according to the terms of whoever is encircling you. All right. So we are encircled, and we need to arise and be alert to the fact that we are encircled in terms of the domain of knowledge production. We need then to break, like this cow that decides to say, I'm going to jump the wall and go outside because you have taken too long to come and open the only entrance that I can use. The exit is blocked. So jump out, fohla. and go outside of the crawl and do things differently. Because it's happening already. You know, I gave the examples of the Rhodes Must Fall movement, you know, the Black Lives Matter. Those are theorizations in praxis, people wanting to chart an alternative future. And they produce ideas and alternatives on the go, at the moment, on the move. They don't wait for an established theory. And I have nothing against established theories, because they were established based on observations or struggles from elsewhere. And probably those struggles had nothing to do with you, but you are jumping onto that theory because you are saying it's established, I'm going to use it. It won't speak to your situation because the conditions from which it was produced are different to yours. It was designed to solve problems in a particular context, in a particular societal conditions that do not obtain where you are. But one thing I want to caution against, I think, in terms of how we think about these things is that we tend to think that all of these things that are there, the theories, the methodologies, and so on, we think that they are of a natural kind, that they have always been there. Outside of them, there cannot be anything else. But they were invented at some point in the history of humanity. So why can't we think otherwise and come up with an alternative pathway? So we need to understand that these are all inventions. These are things that are invented at a particular point in the history of mankind to solve specific problems. And they cannot continue to be, for example, the methodologies that we use largely in the humanities and social sciences, you know, on the African continent and elsewhere, they were sharpened. They were sharpened as instruments for enforcing colonization, coloniality, how to extract knowledge from the colonized. They were sharpened for that purpose. So now that we are talking about independence, decolonizing, working out, how do you work and think differently while you are using an instrument or a tool that was designed to oppress? Certainly the instruments or tool that was designed to oppress cannot all of a sudden become the savior, the one that will be panacea for solving your problems, you know? So we need to think up more broadly, really. There's nothing holy or sacrosanct about, you know, methods and theories that exist. They need to be critiqued, and we need to think differently. That's what poor theory is about. So yeah, I don't know if I've addressed all your questions, Pascal. I missed some of your questions because you were not audible enough anyway. But I hope I've spoken to some of the things you raised.
Oh, thank you, thank you. We are also running out of. Pascal, yes.
We have questions in the room.
2 questions. We have 2 questions. So we'll take both of them at the same. Moving as well as Farid. I'm starting with you.
Okay. Yeah. No. Thank you, Finesse, for your talk. I'm just going to go straight into the questions, which will follow up on some of the other questions. The first has to do with 2 of your metaphors. One is the metaphor of the crown. And I want to link this to one of Sabelo's conclusion about the need to unthink and to rethink thinking, which is learning to unlearn in order to learn. You know, and I'm wondering, with your conception of agency, is your conception of agency still trapped in this framework that you're trying to articulate? Because it seems like you still frame agency as a capacity to act. So what if it was just the capacity to imagine? What if that other cattle we were not jumping? What if in being located in that space, they're actually disrupting? And in a way, isn't that a form of disobedience? Because you're not seeing it, because your lens, the way you're reading it, is still trapped with that colonial lens that you are trying to offer. And then that's one. The other are we taking language too seriously? And this is taking you back to the metaphor of the blind. Is language the blind spot of decoloniality? Given that it does appear to me, and I think we would need to invest in this research, that a large part of the continent really does not care about English, French, or any of the colonial languages, that they actually articulate in what we call local languages. And that when I think about my own community and how many people really work with English or work with French or understand English, and then to take it again to act, is this a bourgeois entrapment? Is it possible that the obsession that we have with language is a bourgeois entrapment? And here I'm just pushing you, trying to be the devil's advocate. And if we then move to language, to taking language seriously, it seems like we are taking writing too seriously, because writing itself is part of the problem, because there are other archives, other sectors of value that we should invest in developing, that many of our languages are not written. Shouldn't that be what we should be focusing on rather than having to codify? Because once you start codifying, you're freezing the language and taking us back to what you're trying to critique. Is language the blind spot of of this decolonial movement? Thank you. Yeah.
I take Farid. Farid, if you can ask your question.
Okay, I will try to be brief. Thank you very much, Professor Ndlovu. Like all analogies, like all parables, I mean, parables have their limitations. And at some point, I mean, I would love to talk to you about more extensively about the limitations of your analogies or your parables, much as I appreciate. But very specifically, the analogy of the elephant. So you have 6 blind white men, and they are approaching them. So you are assuming, I mean, so now the knowledge, how do we harmonize, we remove our whatever, these over our eyes, our eye shades, and how do we then look at the elephant? And the elephant for you, I think, is Africa or African studies or African languages. The problem is that the elephant, in relation to these studies, the elephant is not a concrete entity. So the elephant, I mean, both in your analogy and outside it, so by itself, I mean, the elephant is connected to a larger ecosystem. The elephant is one of the big 5. Who named them the big 5? That's problematic. But zoologists would look at the, okay, so the one is the question of the elephant and how you confine the elephant to this particular entity in front of you. So when we look at Africa, for example, or African studies, where does Africa start? Where does it stop? What about, say, the Madagascar, yes, or the Reunion Islands, and more? When do we perceive Africa? If you look at the Northern Africa as a part of the Levant, the southern Greece or southern Spain or Italy, and a whole connection to the Middle East. So my problem is that when you're looking at an elephant, you're dealing with a fixed entity. But when you look at the real continent, how do you perceive the continent? Where does the continent start? One last point in connection to how you approach the elephant. The elephant has cousins, and this in Latin America, or brothers in Latin America. So where does Latin American or Asian discourse or Indonesian, Timorese, how does that, I mean, and so the problem of looking at the elephant is you're looking at a concrete object. Looking at Africa, Africa is not a concrete object. Geographically, it may be, yes. But any other way, I don't see how it is any other way. Thank you for putting up with my long.
Yes. Can I respond quickly and start off by thanking you, Farid, for those thought-provoking interventions you have provided. And precisely, if you recall the slide on the elephant, I throw in 3 points there about co-creation, collaboration, co-production. And when I raise those points, it touches precisely on the things you mentioned about where does Africa sit within the context of other places like Latin America. So it's about those interconnections. And if I may speak to the idea of using a metaphor, and you are right in some of the things that we miss in using metaphors, but a metaphor essentially is a pathway or an avenue of us trying to explain things. The substance of the matter really does not lie within the metaphor itself, but the implicature, the things that we are trying to get to through the root of a metaphor. And there's limitations, obviously, with that, but those limitations, we can speak to them. And maybe, Farid, we can continue the conversation on offline or by email. You might have my email address somewhere, or otherwise we can continue the conversation. Maybe if I could address the other two questions, I think. So, okay, yeah, Farid, you said something again that I wanted to respond to. That the metaphor of an elephant, I'm putting there 6 blind white men. Those are not my words. I didn't say those are white men. I don't recall saying that. I think maybe there was a misunderstanding.
That was the image.
Well, it's okay. All right. Thank you. Let's leave it at that. I hear what you're saying. Right. Yes, just like as Jesus is said to be white, and Okay, thanks for that. Maybe if I may respond to the other questions by the previous, because I think there is an important things there. So it's about the metaphor of the crawl, that theorizing. When you are inside, trapped inside the crawl, right? In order to theorize, you don't really have to come. You can be doing things while you are inside there, as it were. Now, Walter Mignolo and Catherine Walsh, recently in 2021, I think it was a long seminar they gave. They talk at length about praxis and theory. That the two things, praxis and theory, are not in isolation of one another. So as we theorize, as we engage in theorizing, we are actually engaged in action. We are doing things even while we are theorizing. It doesn't have to be a separate activity on its own. So I take your point there. You might be trapped, but then there has to be a way out, because if you are trapped inside and you are revolving all the time in there and not connecting with other things outside, then there is a problem there, I think. So now, to your question about language as the blind spot of decoloniality, I think you are on point there. If you recall my very first slide about what language is and what it does in society. So language, I think, is indeed the blind spot, particularly if we go further to look at the kind of language that we use, or languages we use for purposes, for example, of academic discourse, of producing knowledge, and so on and so on. So language may indeed be the blind spot of decoloniality. And I think there is more work for us to do in that area. It's a blind spot in the sense that it obscures things in the first instance, and also at the same time, in the sense that it is ignored and it's not seen as the core part of what it means to do African studies. So I think there is work for us to do in that space, really, to redefine or rethink and reimagine what do we mean by language in the first instance. We are not talking about the countable things that we then end up writing down. But you see, the writing part that I'm talking about in harmonization, because we can't run away from the fact that we have institutions of education, right? Where we send our children to schools, they learn, right? That is a reality. That is part of who we are. And so writing is a part of a tradition that we now have. So the triple heritage sort of things that other scholars talk about, you know, that, well, we have a tradition now that is part of who we are, and we can't say now we move away from writing because we want to go back to orality only. I mean, I think it would be self-defeatist really to insist on maybe just using other modalities and not writing is part of the whole process of expressing ideas and so on. But it shouldn't then be the supreme, the only thing we are looking at. There are other modalities of expression. So language, I think, is broader and beyond writing. It's broader and beyond the words that we speak. Even speaking itself has its own limitations. It's not the complete totality of what language is. You know, language is much bigger and broader. And so I think you are on point there. And I agree with you that probably language is one of the blind spots of decoloniality, and we may want to do more work in that. And, you know, yeah, so that's all I can say to that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Finex. I'm not sure whether you'll get time to sleep, but thank you so much. The room is big, taken over by other people.
Okay, yeah, thank you for the opportunity, and thanks everyone for engaging. Thanks for your time. Thank you, bye.
Thank you, bye.
Bye. Thank you very much. Thank you. Sorry we have to cut it.
I need the room is